I'm Helen Dent, I'm Chief Executive for BIVDA. I'm going to hand over to introduce themselves. We're going to open first with future regulations overview from Joseph Burt, who's Head of Diagnostics at MHRA. Joe, if you'd like to introduce yourself and then go ahead. We're going to try and keep it to about 20 minutes per speaker to allow for questions, but please don't forget to put your questions in the chat, and that will be monitored as we go through the call. So thank you very much, and go ahead, Joseph. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Hello, everybody, and good morning. My name is Joseph Burt. I'm the Head of Diagnostics at the MHRA, the UK regulator. And I'm very pleased to be here today to present a little bit more about our future regulations that we are embarking in updating right now. So if we just go to the next slide, please. So the future regulations, just next slide again. The future regulations are very important. The regulations that we have currently in the United Kingdom are very, very old, as you could say. But one of the things we want to do is update these regulations. As the regulator, I want to just maybe introduce the MHRA first, what our mission and vision is. And you can read that on the slide here. As the regulator for medical devices and medicines and other healthcare products, we're here to protect and improve public health. And we do that through our vision in being a world-leading enabled sovereign regulator, protecting public health here in the United Kingdom through regulations, through science, and delivering the right outcomes for our patients across the United Kingdom. Just go to the next slide, please. I mentioned that we are updating our future regulatory framework. The regulatory framework here in the United Kingdom is called UK Medical Devices Regulation 2002 as amended. These were developed quite a while back in 2002, as the title says. And so with the update to these regulations that we are going through, we actually consulted on the future regulations to update the regulatory framework for medical devices. When I say medical devices, it includes many aspects of medical devices. It includes things like software and in vitro diagnostic medical devices. This is just the umbrella term that we use here at the regulator for the term of all medical devices in the United Kingdom. As I mentioned before, our mission is really to protect patients and public health and to ensure there's public safety. So we do this through three very important aspects you can see on the slide. The first one is to improve public and patient safety. Safety is #1 priority for us as the regulator in the United Kingdom. We are doing it also through enhanced transparency and through regulatory decision making. And we want to do as much of our regulations as closely aligned to international best practices. Many are very aware of the new updated regulations in Europe called in vitro diagnostics regulations, IVDR, or the equivalent in medical devices, MDR, medical device regulation. We also have others beyond that, which are more at the international level through a forum called the International Medical Devices Regulators Forum. This is where all the regulators around the world, or most regulators around the world, are able to collaborate together. At the MHRA, we're very keen to make sure that the future regulations that we do have in the United Kingdom are aligned to international best practices. Next slide, please. So we do this through what we call a planned piece of work, and this is a published piece of work called the MedTech Regulatory Framework Strategy. And the strategy is depicted in this slide. It's a little bit busy, but let me try and share a little bit more about some of the key elements of the actual strategy and the roadmap itself. So let's start off with the left-hand side. So at the bottom of the screen, you will see several elements associated with post-market surveillance, PMS. Post-market surveillance looks at putting the products that, like in vitro diagnostic products and medical devices, onto the UK market and making sure that those products are operating as intended. And if there are any vigilance actions or there are any additional actions associated with that device being on the market, then we are introducing new post-market surveillance regulations that require the monitoring of those devices once already being placed onto the UK market. We call that post-market surveillance. That is progressing quite well, and also you may have seen some of the regulations published to the World Trade Organization website. A copy of that is still available on the WTO website, so please feel free to download that. Second to that, to the right of that, is we are publishing a IVD roadmap. We're now going to call it a strategy. It's not really a roadmap. It's an IVD strategy. And this IVD strategy brings together all the wonderful things that we're doing at the agency around the innovation aspect, the science aspect, the regulatory aspects. And we're due to publish that very imminently around what we're doing to bring IVDs together across the United Kingdom from a regulatory science and innovation perspective. To the right-hand side of that, in the IVDR-NI, what that translates to is IVDR for Northern Ireland. So in the United Kingdom, we have the 4 nations, and of course, Great Britain, England, Scotland, and Wales operates under the UK medical device regulation, whereas under the Windsor framework, Northern Ireland operates the EU regulations. The EU regulations I mentioned before, EU IVDR and MDR, medical device regulation. These 2 regulations operate in Northern Ireland. To allow the MHRA to be the competent authority in Northern Ireland, we introduced something called a statutory instrument. It's a piece of instrument that allows the MHRA to be that competent authority in Northern Ireland, operating those EU regulations in Northern Ireland. So you're probably thinking now, why do we have 2 regulations? Well, because we have the Windsor framework. The Windsor framework requires Northern Ireland to operate EU regulations, and in Great Britain, we operate the UK medical device regulations. So there are 2 regulatory frameworks in the United Kingdom: EU regulations for Northern Ireland, and then GB regulations, UK MDR 2002 for Great Britain. So that's what that IVDR for Northern Ireland allows us to do. Along to the right-hand side of that, you'll see several items associated with SAMD. SAMD stands for Software as a Medical Device. As we start to see many of the aspects of software being infused into the medical world, we also need to think about how we introduce guidance associated with them. So there are many aspects of software that now include AI elements, software firmware elements to operate the device itself, and good machine learning. Over the coming weeks and months, we are due to publish more guidance associated with software as a medical device. And you'll see more of this publication coming out shortly. And it touches on to the AI space as well, artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is very hot in the news right now. It's very prevalent across the world. And we are no different here in the United Kingdom. My colleagues in the MHRA are looking at software as a medical device, but more particularly artificial intelligence as a medical device through the development and deployment lifecycle phases. We are introducing what we call an AI airlock. An AI airlock is a very interesting term. It's a sandbox that allows developers to really think about what are the regulatory aspects to consider when developing a medical device, a software as a medical device or an AI medical device. Further on to the right-hand side, you'll probably see more of the future regulations consultation. So we are due to do another consultation later in this year. The date has not been firmed yet, but this is to refine some of the things that we consulted on back in 2021. And that's to really detail out some of the elements that weren't as clearly defined in the 2021 consultation. So that's on the right-hand side. And let's go to the top of the line of 2024. As I mentioned, there are future regulations that are coming in over the course of the coming few years. We are doing a lot of engagement sessions around these future regulations. We've had a few already. Some are actually recorded, some are published on the MHRA website as well. We call these future core regulations. In the future core regulations, they talk about many aspects, such as the scope of the regulations, the classifications on essential requirements, labeling, instructions for use, approved body engagement, and exempted devices. We'll also have upcoming discussions on clinical investigations of medical devices, looking at the obligations of economic operators, quality management system requirements, and conformity assessment of devices itself. And then later on in this year, we will also have more discussions around UDI, or unique device identifiers. These are identifiers specifically on the device itself that describe how the device is actually pushed through the supply chain and the traceability of those devices in the supply chain, but also down to the users itself. And then we'll talk a little bit more about how we transition from the current regulations into the future regulations through the transitional arrangements later on in this year. So with all of these regulations, we have to publish. We are part of a global organization for the United Kingdom. It's called the WTO, World Trade Organization, and we're obligated to publish the future regulations on the WTO website. And we would do that later on in this year, in the later half of this year, and then following that, publish the actual regulations, the future regulations, into Parliament, and you'll see that in 2025, sometime in 2025. The plan is then to bring these new regulations into force sometime in 2025. Date yet to be defined. You can see here there's a lot of dependencies that are going to be determined. One of them, obviously, is the electoral life cycle and, of course, parliamentary time. But as you can see here, there's a lot of regulations that we are updating. We are going to put lots of guidance out, and we are going to be able to push this through the regulatory process. But in that pushing through that regulatory process, we want to make sure we're engaging at the MHRA with organizations such as BIVDA, ABHI, and other trade and industry organizations, and yourselves. Go to the next slide, please. One of the things I just want to share as one of the updates to the regulations is around the definition of an in vitro diagnostic device. So we have a definition today, and that definition includes everything in the black text that you can read on the screen. What we are doing is updating the definition of an in vitro diagnostic device to bring it in line with some of the international definitions, along with the inclusion of software. You can see here the red text that we're incorporating into the future regulations. Software is so prevalent these days. It's really hard to not have a device that doesn't include software. Certainly in many laboratory settings, pathology laboratories and others, software is so important in managing the actual process of getting a sample down to the diagnostic output. So software is now going to be included in the definition of an IVD device. Also, in alignment with a lot of the international definitions for an in vitro diagnostic device, we're going to align with including the other red text that you can see on the screen around the physical or mental impairment information, along with concerns around the predisposition to a medical condition or disease. And also to incorporate the definition of predicting a treatment response or reaction. This definition will come into force once we lay the future core regulations as well. But the current regulations already incorporate this definition without the red text that you can read on the screen. Next slide, please. So another aspect that we're changing as part of the future core regulations is the classification and classes system. So in the current classes and classification system, in the current regulations, we are very familiar with the IVD directive and this annex called Annex 2, List A, List B. And you can see that on the left side of the screen. List A, List B, as well as self-test IVD devices would be requiring a conformity assessment to be executed by an approved body. And then you would be given a certificate of conformity, and then you can place a UKCA marking on that device. Many devices these days actually are general devices, general class devices in the current regulations. They do not require a UK approved body, but you can self-declare against the essential requirements and the regulations of today. And then you can declare that through a self-declaration statement, and then you would have a placement of the UKCA mark to then allow you to register that with the MHRA. We're going to change that. Most of devices these days are sitting in that general devices group, but as we move into a much more streamlined world where there's a lot more integration with other parts of the world, we want to adopt an international approach. And the international approach is using the thing on the right-hand side, the classification system. So it goes from a Class A, B, C, and D approach, where Class A is the lowest risk and Class D is the highest risk. A lot of the devices that we have in general class today will move from a self-declaration to a requiring a UK approved body to perform that conformity assessment. The reason for that is because we are asking for much more of the devices to go into the B, C, and D categories. Class A will be very limited to the lowest risks. They'll be similar to things like receptacles, instruments that are really not going to have a huge risk profile associated with the patients and the public. So with that, the future classification systems will be introduced as part of the future core regulations. The future core regulations will include a classification rule set. So to determine which class you approach to be of your device, A, B, C, or D, you follow a set of rules. There are 7 rules. These rules are very similar to what we have in the EU. There are some specific nuances that are for the United Kingdom. And one of the things we want to make sure is these rules allow you to be very clear in which class your device will fall into. So many of the devices today are in the general class, and they're self-declared. In the future, that will be switched around. Many of the devices will not be self-declared. They will be conformity assessed by a third party called an approved body. Only a very small, well, a group of Class A devices can be self-declared after you followed those classification rules. Next slide, please. So what does this actually mean in terms of in vitro diagnostic devices and the scope of the devices overall? So today we have the current UK regulations that really apply to all IVD devices. But in the future, we will start to incorporate other devices that comes into the future regulations. For example, direct-to-consumer tests. We really have a lot of direct-to-consumer tests sold online or in high street stores today. They will have to be put into the future regulations, and they will be adopted to follow that classification system A, B, C, D, and be conformity assessed accordingly. Self-test IVDs, we have those today. I mentioned that in the previous slide, where self-tests need to have a UK conformity assessment to be performed. And unfortunately, that's not as rigorous as it should be. So we're going to change that to be much more rigorous in the future classification system. Laboratory-based tests are in the current regulations, so they'll continue to be in the future regulations. We'll also introduce 2 new areas that will be in the scope of the future regulations: companion diagnostics. These are diagnostic devices with use of a specific medicine, and therapeutic drug monitoring in vitro diagnostic devices. They will also be included in the future classification system and the future scope of the regulations. As you can see on the slide there, there are other areas in which the future regulations will bring into scope. And these details of this can actually be read through or listened through a webinar that the MHRA held on the 5th of March. That is available on the MHRA website. Please feel free to search for it. You can go into Google and look at the webinar and replay it for yourself. The key message I want to share here is that the future regulations are coming. The future regulations are going to change in vitro diagnostic devices definition. We're also going to change the scope and the way we classify and assign a class to the actual IVDs itself. There are many changes coming, and most of these changes will have an impact to the way that in vitro diagnostics are executed today through conformity assessment, through the definition of the future regulations that will impact the activities that you do today. So the important thing here is keep in touch and keep in contact with the MHRA and certainly with all of the webinars and sessions that we are having through ABHI along with BIVDA, who are helping us through the actual process of communicating a lot of these changes that are coming through in the future regulations. And with that, I want to say thank you very much, and I look forward to any questions that anyone might have later on in the meeting. Thank you. So now I'd like to pass over to Mike. Mike, over to you.
Thanks, Joseph. I think we've had a change in running order.
First.
Oh,
yeah.
Sorry.
Brilliant. Thanks all. Thanks, Joseph. Thanks to the Pathology Alliance for holding this meeting. I really appreciate it and great to be alongside BIVDA colleagues. So just a really quick intro. ABHI, the Association of British Health Tech Industries, we've got about 400 industry members, ranging from very large corporate manufacturers to very small manufacturers, plus a whole load of consultancy firms and associate firms, legal firms who support medical device industry in the UK. It's been going for about 30 or so years, and it's really around set up around regulation. So this kind of really going to the core of what ABHI was set up to do. And we cover the whole range of devices, from medical devices, in vitro diagnostic devices, and digital devices across the whole range. I've been with ABHI for about 3 years. My job title is Director of Diagnostics and Digital Regulation. Before that, I spent about 20 years at MHRA, where I was kind of involved in IVDR policy development. And I was also chair of the European Commission IVD working group. Before that, I did a little bit of clinical. I was qualified as a biomedical scientist, but that training is so far in the past. I understand kind of where you guys are, but there's no way I'd be safe to practice. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to put a little bit of colour on the classification system that Joseph talked about, just to try and kind of give it a bit of context. I'm mostly going to go for a more international context in what I'm talking about, rather than the UK focus that Joseph has given us. So this is just an illustration of what might be in those product classifications based on the EU IVDR. Now, it's really important to note that the EU IVDR classification system is based on the same international model that the UK will be using. That's the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. So it's not the same system, but it's the same model. So we can see in there Class D is those very high risk products. HIV, Hep B, the kind of blood screening, blood grouping, but also some of those kind of high risk, highly transmissible pathogens that you might see with hemorrhagic fevers, some of the high biological safety levels. As well as things like COVID currently is the test for COVID would be in Class D. And as Joseph says, those Class A devices over on the left, they're kind of the specimen receptacles, the low risk instrumentation, and some basic histologic stains. The majority of products that you'll be using, I guess, will be in that, and there's middle two classifications, class B and C. If I was to predict what's the difference between the EU and the UK system, my personal prediction would be around genetic tests and companion diagnostics, but there may also be other slight differences as well. We're going to look to see what that looks like when that can be published. Not a lot to say about this that Joseph hasn't already said. B, C, and D will be looked at by a conformity assessment in the EU by a conformity assessment body called a notified body. In the UK, they're called approved bodies. In the EU, they're called notified bodies, but they're all conformity assessment bodies. So having that extra scrutiny, that extra clinical evidence, that extra performance data, or not necessarily extra clinical evidence, it may be that it's the same clinical evidence but formatted so that the approved body, the notified body, can review that in a timely way. So that's just kind of some of the colour on the EU classification system to add on to what Joseph said about the UK system. Next slide, please. Now, Joseph didn't put this up. This is one of Joseph's infographics. It's something I think Joseph should be rightly proud of getting that on the .gov.uk website. I think the reason why I didn't is because there may be some changes to this coming up. And it's great that MHRA have given themselves the flexibility to change this and respond to events. But you can see here that anything that was in the high risk area under the old directives, list A, list B, and self-test, they will need to rely on their certificates, and those certificates will be changing from, in this infographic, May 2025. We'll talk about that start date in a moment, and from that start date, we'll be relying on IVDR-C certification, the new regulations. If it's a general product under the old directives, but it's moving to the new regulations, this is for CE marked IVDs, not UKCA, CE marked IVDs, so things that are coming from the EU to the GB market. They can rely on self-declaration, or as a transition across to IVD certification, that will come through. I think that IVD self-declaration will probably not be used after whatever that start date is, because I think it's going to be difficult for manufacturers to do that and difficult for them to get products through border control. But technically, in the law, I think it would still be allowed. And then those low-risk products, they will all need to be, if they're a CE marked product placed on the market in GB, they will all need to be compliant with IVDR, but that would be through a self-declaration route. So in the next couple of slides, I'm just going to talk about that start date, and then I'll talk about that end date. But bear in mind, the start date there is May 2025, and the end date is June 2030. So let's look at that start date in the next slide, please. So this is a slide from colleagues at MedTech Europe. They're the EU-wide trade association that we're part of, and this is a slide that they've come up with to look at the proposed extension to the transitions for IVDR. It was proposed just before Christmas. It's going through the legislation process in the EU now, and I think it's highly likely, in my personal view, it's highly likely that this will be adopted pretty much as is. And you can see that basically all of those transition dates for Class D, Class C, Class B, and Class A, if they're sterile, will be moved on 2.5 years. So instead of having to comply with IVDR for Class D devices by May 2025, they will have to comply by December 2027. That's for existing devices which already have a declaration of conformity. If it's a new device, then it will need to comply with the IVDR from whenever it gets placed on the market. But if it's an existing device that was existing already with a self-declaration, then those transition dates can move forward by 2.5 years. And that's to give the notified bodies plenty of time to do the assessments. We'll talk about how long it takes to do a notified body assessment in a moment. And that's also to make sure that manufacturers have enough time to put that clinical data together and ensure that products remain on the market. One of the things that we were worried about is May 2025 is only 1 year away, and it takes at least 18 months to get a certificate, probably 3 months just to get on the notified body's books. So we're talking about 18 months, 2 years to get a certificate. If you haven't applied already, if a manufacturer hasn't applied already for a Class D certificate, they were never going to make that May 2025 deadline. So that's why I think there's some benefit in having the shifting that date from May 2025 to December 2027. And then again for Class Bs and Class Cs and Class A sterile. So that's what we're expecting to see in the EU for IVDR. There's also similar transition extensions for MDR. They're slightly different, but we won't go into those here. Next slide, please. So there's a figure that many of you will recognise doing this famous teapot stance. Jeremy Hunt was the Secretary of State for Health and is now the Chancellor of the Exchequer. As Chancellor, he talked about international recognition, and he said that MHRA will be moving to a different model, which will allow a near automatic sign-off for devices which are already approved by trusted regulators, such as the US, EU, or Japan. I'll just concentrate on that first paragraph for the moment, and then we'll move on to the second paragraph. So the UK is probably about roughly 3 or 4% of the global market for devices. Some higher, some lower, but generally about 3 or 4%. So it's quite a difficult business case for an international manufacturer to say, oh, we need to have a UKCA mark, a whole new system which is just for the UK. When we have actually a system for the EU and a system for the US. So if there's international recognition, then that means that CE mark could be recognised indefinitely. So that 2030 deadline that was in the early infographic would go away, and there would be indefinite recognition of CE marking. And that's great. That would be fine. There would need to be post-market surveillance in place, and Joseph's already told us about the progress of the UK legislation on post-market surveillance. So that would really help to understand what how products are performing and whether the MHRA needs to take any action. But there is this transition problem, and the transition deadlines moving, shifting. There's also a concern around, I guess, any attrition of particularly IVDs products. Manufacturers using the data transition as a breakpoint in their decisions around whether or not a product will continue in their portfolio, or actually finding that it may not be economically viable for them to make that transition. So I think we can anticipate some attrition around the transition point for IVDR, and that means that some of the products that are available to you now with a CE mark will no longer be available to you in the future. For the 510K, if there's an opportunity for UK to recognise technologies approved by the US, then that might include what's called 510K in the US by the Food and Drugs Administration. 510K is a bit more problematic because there are a couple of things missing. First of all, the post-market surveillance. Again, we've talked about that already. Secondly, is the quality management system in the US is very different to the quality management system used in the EU and the UK. So that could be addressed by just asking US manufacturers to have a valid quality management system, such as we use. But then there's also the use of predicate devices. So the FDA 510K system allows a manufacturer to compare their device to another device on the market. And if it's substantially equivalent, then there's not so much clinical evidence to acquire. That's really difficult. And I'd really like to see what those conversations look like around how 510K can be accepted in the GB market, particularly for IVDs, where there's a lot of comparison with the gold standard, and that's a generally expected way in which IVDs demonstrate their performance is by comparison with a gold standard. So it'd be interesting to see that discussion. Looking at that second paragraph there, at the same time from next year, I think maybe we'll stretch next year definition. MHRA will set up a swift new approval process for the most cutting-edge devices to ensure the UK becomes a global centre for their development. And this is around kind of what is the innovation framework in the UK for getting new and innovative devices being able to be used by you for your patients. And I think that's where the UKCA mark can really work well. And that be for UK developers making products which are initially intended for the UK. We already have a number of components of an innovation framework. We have IDAP, which was set up by MHRA recently. IDAP is the Innovative Devices Access Pathway. It allows people with new innovative devices which meet an unmet clinical need to get additional support for regulation and for health technology assessment and adoption in the NHS. There is a pilot running at the moment. There are 8 products in that pilot, not very many, but there are a few, and most of them are diagnostics and digital. So there is a UK regulatory framework around this. Next slide, please. So there are things which are changing in the EU, which may change which may inspire MHRA to think about what changes would be needed in the UK. Use of real-world evidence. So the work that you're doing now on the bench and how well those devices perform in your hands, does that have an impact on how products are assessed for getting to the market? And does that mean that you can shift that balance between pre-market and post-market? Can you get better understanding of a product safety profile from the work that you do? And there's a definite desire amongst industry to take more advantage of real-world evidence. Predictable timings and costs for assessment. I had a manufacturer who's a member of ours write to me and say, Steve, I had a new product. It wasn't innovative. It wasn't eligible for IDAP. I had a new product and I wanted to get it on the market. I wrote to a number of notified bodies in the EU, and while I was waiting for them to answer, because it took them a long time to answer, I had a look at the FDA. The FDA said it will cost me $21,000 and take 4 months, and will answer any questions that you've got. So that's the route he took. After he made that decision, well, one of the EU notified bodies said, I'm sorry it took us so long. It'll take us about 18 months to 2 years, and we're not really sure how much it's going to cost in total. So having predictability around getting products into the market in the EU and in the UK is really important, so that you have access to those new products and they're not just going for a US first. So all of those new products which could help your patients could come into the EU and could come into the UK. The innovation framework, we've already talked about IDAP, and there's a whole lot of other things which I think the EU is looking at, which could inspire them to bring more innovation to the EU or the UK first, instead of, as we've just described, going to the US first. And then there may be some classification changes. Could COVID come out from Class D into a Class B or C, which might make some products easier to get onto the market? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? That's one that's open for discussion. And then my final slide before I hand over to Mike. Next slide, please. Yeah. So there are some exemptions, and I know that the health institution exemption is something that you really want to talk about, and Mike's got some great slides which will lead you through that. Just want to give the kind of international flavour to that. It's not exactly the same, but the nearest equivalent in the USA is a laboratory developed test. This is anything which is designed, manufactured, and used within a commercial laboratory in the US. And you'll all have heard of Theranos and some of the mistakes that happen there. But there's actually also some really good things that have happened through use of LDTs in the US. But the FDA is saying, well, we're seeing an increase in how these devices are used, what their risk profile is, and what the complexity of using the devices are, what the usability is. And we think we need to make some changes. So they've proposed a different way of regulating laboratory developed tests. So under the current system and in the proposed future system, an LDT is an IVD covered by the regulations. But whereas up until now, the FDA have decided not to enforce the requirements, they've used at discretion, and they're now proposing phasing out that enforcement discretion. You'll see on that little table from an FDA slide that that's going to be staged over a few years if that legislation comes in. And that would take them as far as doing FDA doing pre-market review of those products. That's not as far as the EU has taken it. So the EU has not gone as far as pre-market review of health institution exempted tests. So at the bottom box there, you can see the EU health institution exemption, which also applies in Northern Ireland, because Northern Ireland, as Joseph has described into the Windsor framework, accepts IVDR and MDR. Devices which are made or modified and used within the same legal entity that meet the relevant requirements for safety and performance around risk management and labelling and instructions, and all of those detailed requirements that we see in the MDR and IVDR. That's from already that applies for products which could be exempted from the MDR and IVDR. But in order to do that, and these are some requirements that come into place in the future, there is an appropriate quality system in place that might take up elements of 15189. There is some technical documentation in place, and this information is made publicly available. So they're the things which are coming into force next month in May 2024. And then that antepenultimate bullet point, there is a justification for applying the exemption. That's on patient needs, on target patient needs. That requirement will come in 2028. So that's my talk. That's my segue through to Mike on health institution exemption. Thank you very much. Mike, over to you.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's fantastic to see so many of the pathology community engaged and online with this discussion. As I'm sure many of you will be aware, we've been sort of highlighting some of these challenges and the changes that have been coming for the past 4 or 5 years probably now, and of course there's still lots of change happening and probably lots of confusion at your side. So we're hoping to try to straighten out and clarify and reassure you of where things are at, and that this is the start of the sort of process to working with you to help you to understand what's coming down the line and to help you get into compliance and ready and prepared for it as easily and as painlessly as possible. So my name's Mike Messenger. I'm currently head of regulatory strategy at BIFDA, but I also have a few other hats. I'm an independent consultant working for a few firms. I'm a senior regulatory advisor to FIND, which is an NGO based in Geneva, trying to accelerate the introduction of new diagnostic tests in some of the poorest countries of the world. Visiting professor at the University of Leeds in health technology innovation and sort of diagnostic regulatory science and performance evaluation. I'm a member of BSICH 212 and ISO TC 212 working groups developing international standards for IVDs and for sort of laboratory medicine. And I'm also a trusted advisor and was former head of diagnostics at the MHRA. Just a very quick introduction to BIFDA as well. So BIFDA was formed in 1992, and it is the National Association for the IVD industry. And it represents about 97% of this industry and has about 280 companies and organizations in the IVD sector. It's specialized, focused specifically on IVDs, so we don't do the rest of medtech. And I've been at BIFDA now since March, so very happy to be here and representing the organization. So next slide, please. So as the title of my talk suggests, I'm going to give you a quick overview of where we are at the moment with the Health Institute exemption, which I'm sure many people here are familiar with and are applying today, and what the potential or likely direction of travel in the UK or in Great Britain, I should say, is going to be. So it's important to say that these views are my own and don't represent the MHRA and are indicative of what's in the publicly available information in the public domain. But the situation is still emerging, as you heard from Joseph, and will be clarified over the coming year or so. So under the current Medical Device Regulation 2002, Regulation 33, there is an exemption for health institutions like laboratories to manufacture or modify medical devices in-house for specific patient needs without meeting the requirements, the full requirements of MDR 2002. So the scope of this is that it applies to in vitro diagnostics and their accessories that are produced and used within the institution, so within the premises or the sort of the estate of the institution within which they're manufactured, for non-commercial purposes, and that its use is intrinsic to the operation of the health institution. So you can find out a bit more about this on this link below. I think we'll be making the slides available, so you can go and read the current guidance on the regulation and the MHRA's current interpretation of Regulation 33. Next slide, please. So what currently defines a health institution? So this is slightly more challenging, as there is currently no formal definition in law. So it's the interpretation of the MHRA that is published in guidance. So the MHRA currently interprets a health institution to mean a body whose primary purpose is the care and or promotion of public health. So NHS trusts, or National Blood Authority, or even private hospitals, whose primary responsibility is the care and or promotion of public health. Organisations that aren't considered to be health institutions are freestanding laboratories who aren't necessarily connected to an organisation whose primary purpose is the care and or promotion of public health, and organisations like gyms, spas, fitness or wellness centres, or clinics which are established purely to provide diagnostic services. Next slide, please. So many of you may remember back in sort of September 2021, the MHRA ran a public consultation on the future regulation of medical devices and IVDs in the UK, aiming to refine and update these regulations following our exit from the European Union. It received about 900 responses, 891 responses to the public consultation, of which half were from individuals and about half were from organisations, including NHS organisations, patient organisations, industry, etc. The purpose of the public consultation was to gather public and stakeholder feedback on proposed changes to the regulatory framework for medical devices and in vitro diagnostics in the UK. And this was generally based upon the framework that MHRA and Steve in particular had been very involved in developing for the European Union, which itself is also aligned with the International Medical Device Regulatory Forum's general best practice principles for medical device regulation. So this had been a long time in development, and UK and MHRA stakeholders have been very heavily involved in developing and devising these regulations. The focus of the public consultation was primarily around enhancing patient safety, in particular as a result of the Cumberledge Review, and adapting to technological advances, ensuring greater transparency of regulatory decision-making, global alignment with international best practice principles to support both improvements in patient safety and performance, but also improved opportunities for regulatory recognition and reliance, and ensuring market stability and access to essential medical devices and diagnostics in the UK. I've put the link to the government response to the public consultation here, which I'd encourage anybody who is interested to have a good read of. It is a very interesting document for anybody who's looking to plan for these particular issues going forward, and it lays out the direction of travel of the MHRA, as you'll see in a second. So next slide, please. So this is the sort of the high-level summary of some of the interesting aspects with regards to health institutes and the health institute exemption that came out of a public consultation. And you can see that generally there was very high levels of agreement from stakeholders of the public around the proposals that the MHRA had put forward. So you can see here about 90% of the 900 odd participants supported the inclusion of the definition of health institution in the legislation, sort of clarify some of those areas. 84% supported in-house manufactured or modified medical devices to be required to meet the relevant essential requirements that medical devices and IVDs are required to meet. 76% were in favour of manufacturers of in-house devices having a suitable quality management system, and 65% wanted to see justification for why the needs could not be met with an equivalent device that was available on the market. Similarly, 75% were in favour of such manufacturers having to keep technical information available for review by the MHRA, reviewing clinical use of the devices and ensuring that they continue to be safe and effective, and taking necessary corrective actions where they identify issues. And 84% of these stakeholders wanted to see such issues and safety alerts or field safety corrective actions reported to the MHRA. About 70% of registrations also of participants also wanted to see devices manufactured in-house to be registered with the MHRA, and 77% want to see these registrations extended to include performance studies as well. So these are clinical and analytical evaluations of medical devices. The details on what type of performance studies to be included are still to be elucidated. And 76% of participants also wanted to exclude manufactured devices, that in-house manufactured devices that were manufactured on an industrial scale. Although again, what exactly an industrial scale means is still to be determined, and the EU have put out some of their interpretations on this, which doesn't really help to clarify, in my humble opinion, what necessarily constitutes an industrial scale. But the public consultation really did highlight that the responses indicated broad agreement that the exemption should not apply in cases where such services are provided for commercial or profitable purposes. Again, there's a bit of detail that will need to be clarified here in the future legislation and the interpretation and guidance around it, around how this might apply to, say, private hospitals or private pathology service providers of NHS pathology services. So there's a bit of nuance in this, but in general, those broad agreement that these services should not be provided for commercial or profitable purposes. So you can see here that there was strong agreement from the public consultation to support these proposed changes to the legislation. Next slide, please. So within this same document, you can also find MHRA's response to the public consultation, which again is not necessarily sort of formal policy or legislation yet, but outlines their direction of travel and where they want to go with this. But there's still a lot of unpicking and nuancing that needs to be done around this, which Joseph and others will be busy doing at the moment. So the MHRA stated in their consultation that they will provide an exemption from most of the future regulatory requirements for IVDs and medical devices for health institutions, including UKCA marking, approved body involvement, and the requirement for a certified quality management system. So you still require a quality management system, but it doesn't have to be certified by an approved body. And this is to reduce the burden on health institutions. They are going to try to clarify what institutions and/or devices will be exempted, including those that are manufactured at an industrial scale. And they have clarified that the exemption will not apply in cases where services are provided for commercial or profitable purposes. They have stated that they will place more extensive requirements and greater scrutiny upon health institutions, including the requirement for a quality management system, technical documentation, retention requirements, adverse incident reporting, registration of devices and the provision of information to the MHRA, registration of some forms of performance studies, and the requirement for devices to meet the essential requirements of the medical device and IVD regulations. Next slide, please. So what does this all mean for you and for GB, Great Britain, pathology services? So the reason why I've had to specify GB here is that under the Windsor framework, Northern Irish health institutions must comply with the IVDR, MDR requirements, and institutions applying the exemption in Northern Ireland should now follow the MDCG guidance, and the link for that is here. So everything that I'm going to say from now on only applies to GB pathology services. Next slide, please. So the good news, and there is good news here, is that there is a lot of alignment with ISO 15189. So if you're already using 15189 and if your services are already accredited to 15189, then you're a good way there. So from a quality management perspective, 15189 requires labs to establish and maintain a QMS, and this aligns with the likely requirement for documented and maintained QMS that covers design, development, and performance evaluation of in-house tests. ISO 15189 also focuses on documentation retention necessary to ensure consistent operation and quality of laboratory services. And this is parallel to the likely requirements for detailed documentation of the design and performance of in-house tests. Again, 15189 highlights the importance of ensuring that personnel are qualified and competent to perform their roles. And this is similar to the potential future legislative requirements on personnel competence related to manufacturing and handling of in-house tests. And finally, ISO 15189 includes provisions for risk management related to laboratory processes, which can be extended to meet the requirements for a specific risk management system for in-house tests and incorporate other standards like this should say ISO 14917, which is the medical device risk management standard. So there's a lot already within what you do in terms of your best practice around 15189, which will help you on your journey to compliance with the future regs. Next slide, please. But there are some areas where you will need to look a bit deeper into. So whilst 15189 will support many aspects of compliance with the future regs, it is unlikely to be sufficient on its own. So some of the other areas that will require future consideration I've pulled out here for you to have a think about. So performance evaluation is one area. So whilst 15189 includes the need for validation and verification of methods, the proposed regulations requirements are more detailed with regards to requiring ongoing data collection on the performance of devices and performance evaluations that include demonstration of scientific validity, analytical performance, and clinical performance. Now, you probably do most of this already to one degree or another. It's just a matter of documenting and capturing that data and ensuring that you do so across the life cycle of the device. In terms of manufacturing, health institutes will likely need to draw up documentation outlining the manufacturing facility, the manufacturing process, and the design and performance of the devices. Again, many aspects of this you will probably already be doing as part of your best practice, but maybe not necessarily documenting it formally or in a way that is fully compliant with the future regulations. You will need to comply with the essential requirements and document your compliance against these, and I'll talk about this a bit more in the next slide. And there is likely, can we just go back one slide? There is likely to be increased post-market surveillance and vigilance requirements, in particular the need for health institutions to demonstrate the absence of a suitable alternative device, and this is likely to need to be demonstrated on an ongoing basis. And health institutes will also likely need to actively monitor the performance of their in-house manufactured devices after they're put into service and to report any adverse incidents or field safety corrections to MHRA. And finally, there is most likely to be a requirement to register your devices with the MHRA. Next slide, please. So whilst many of these other factors that I've been mentioning are probably familiar to most of you, the essential requirements that we've been discussing are probably alien, I would imagine, to many people on this call who haven't been involved in the medical device or IVD industry from a manufacturing or other perspective. So the essential requirements, the MHRA intends to broadly reflect the EU IVDR's general safety and performance requirements, GSPRs, in the UK regs, and to tailor these to the UK context. So the GSPRs provide a very high level criteria for the safety and performance which is applicable to the design, production, and post-production aspects of medical devices and IVDs throughout the life cycle. You can go and you can find the EU GSPRs already. They are in Annex 1 of the EU IVDR 2017-746. They're principle-based, which means that as the state of the art changes, health institutions must continue to consider if the device remains compliant with them. State of the art in regulation is somewhat different to the more colloquial use of it. It doesn't mean the sort of a bleeding edge of innovation. It actually means the sort of the lower limit of best practice is where sort of state of the art is at in a medical device regulatory perspective. Now we may, if people found it valuable, we may dive into the GSPRs and how to meet compliance with them as part of a future session. But here I've just kind of highlighted the three major groups. So the first group is the sort of the general requirements, and these are likely to apply to all health institutions. In Chapter 2, we then have the requirements regarding performance design and manufacture. And many of these will be relevant to health institutions looking to manufacture IVDs, but some of them might depend on the type of test and where the test is used and who will be using the test. And finally, in Chapter 3, there are the requirements regarding information supplied with the device. And many of these may not be applicable to health institutes. So if it is of value, please let us know and we can consider having a deeper dive into learning more about the essential requirements and methods and approaches to demonstrating conformity against them. Next slide, please. So what we would really like to hear from you all on as part of the discussion here, but also the ongoing engagement that we would like to have with yourselves over the coming months is to really hear what your outstanding concerns are with regards to the proposed changes, what training, support, or resources you think that you will need in order to implement them, and also to hear from you whether there are any specific tests, technologies, or case studies which you think are going to be particularly challenging, and where such regulatory changes could provide a real risk to patient or public health. So I'll shut up there and pass over to Helen to open the floor for a discussion.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Joseph. There's a lot of information there. There are a few questions in the chat, so I'm just going to address those from first to last. What we will do, as I mentioned at the beginning of the call, is we will summarise these into a Q&A where we can. And we'll send a short survey out to your organisations with these questions from Mike's slide, plus a few others as well. And I'll pop those into the chat just before the end of the call. But if I could just start to everybody with the first question. And like I said, if any can't be answered immediately, then we can follow up on those. But the first one is, who determines what a wellness product is? In fact, you can see what they are in the chat. I can read them to you if you like. But I think this one's probably for you, Joseph, the first one.
Yeah, sure. No problem, Helen. Thank you very much for the question as well. Excellent question. So the determination of what a wellness product is, you've got to add the words, if it has a medical purpose to it. So if it has a medical purpose, it is going to be part of the future regulations. And so if it does have a medical purpose or a diagnosis purpose, then it would be captured as a wellness product with a medical intent. That would then be within the scope of the future medical devices regulation, and so it would be regulated accordingly. Who determines that? It's going to be the person that defines the intended purpose statement, and that's often the manufacturer of that product. So if it has a medical purpose and the manufacturer says it has a medical purpose, then it would be in the scope of the medical devices regulation.
Great, thank you very much. Next question is for LTTs without CE marking. Is the plan to have a higher risk formally assessed by expert assessors or self-declaration?
Helen, who would you like?
Sorry, I thought that was you again, Joseph. Sorry, I apologise.
That's for CE marking. So do you want me to take that?
Yes, go ahead, Steve.
Okay. So for the health institution exemption under IVDR, that's for CE marking products. The IVDR does not require a third-party notified body assessment for any device, whether it's high risk or not. However, you need the health institution would need to meet the requirements of the essential requirements set out in Annex 1, which includes a benefit risk assessment. So it's a much higher bar for a high risk product because you need to get that benefit risk established, but it would always be self-declaration.
Thank you. Next question is, what is the timescale for genetic tests which were not in scope of current regulations, May 25 or December 28?
None of those. So the answer to your question, Carolyn, is basically genetic tests will really depend on what type of genetic tests. So we have lots of types of genetic tests at the moment. The future regulations will include genetic testing specifically. And as I mentioned in my part of the presentation, there's a set of classification rules that are going to be used to help you identify the types of genetic tests. Based on that, they will then go into a certain class, A, B, C, D class system. Those class systems and the classification rules will come in once we've actually passed through the whole regulation, the future regulations, through the parliamentary process. And then there's a transition period. That transition period we're still working on at the moment. So I can't give you the exact date, May 25 or 28. It's none of those because we're still working through those right now. So, but what we are going to do is incorporate genetic tests into the scope of the future regulations, and there's a transition period.
Thank you. Steve, I'll go to you before I ask the next question.
Thank you, Helen. Just to add on from a CE marking perspective under IVDR, if it's a genetic test which was not in the scope of IVDD, but is in the scope of IVDR, which I think is where this question is coming from, then it would not have a declaration of conformity to IVDD. Therefore, the transition would be May 2022. May 22. So it's already passed. So it would already need to be, unless you're applying the health institution exemption, that's slightly separate. But if it's a CE marked product in the EU, then May 2022 would have been the transition time.
Thanks, Steve. Next question is, would reagents such as antibodies used in LDTs fall into Class C?
Steve, you want to take that one?
They might. Again, it depends on the intended purpose. If it meets the rules, remember the classification is a rules-based system. If it meets the rules for Class C because of the intended purpose and the characteristics of the product, then it could well be Class C.
Thank you. Next question is it still intended to exclude from HIE any testing which has a commercial element? I think this might have been answered in one of the slides, actually. Does this pose a risk to patient safety as a large amount of UK testing would be caught by this either joint ventures, outsources with the NHS or network referral labs?
So I think this is something that the devil will be sort of in the detail of the legislation and in the interpretation of the legislation as it comes out, and I think MHRA will be looking to get that balance right. Certainly under the current framework, there is a recognition of say commercial pathology service providers and how they integrate contractually with NHS trusts in this sort of space, and how that differs from clinics that are set up purely for commercial purposes to provide laboratory testing services. But MHRA have clarified that under the new exemption, their view is that tests that are purely for commercial or profitable purposes will be excluded from the exemption. But I think there's a lot of nuance here that needs to be unraveled in the regulation that I think hopefully Joseph and other colleagues will be consulting on, these sorts of areas and understanding what type of arrangements and risks there may be that need to be considered as that policy is developed.
Thank you. More questions, bear with me a second, it just flicked off. Quite a complex subject, so I'm just going back up to the top. Is there any guidance to what NHS labs should be asking the suppliers and when, so that labs know that they are selecting reagents and consumables appropriately?
Helen, maybe I can start off with that, and then Mike, if you can help me out as well, and Steve. So the important thing here is the reagents and consumables should really have a conformity assessment mark. That's really where we would start from. So that would be a UKCA mark or a CE mark. So that's a really good starting point to say, do you have, are you following the conformity of the regulations accordingly? And then from there, you can ask a myriad of other questions associated with the procurement process. But that's really outside my knowledge and expertise and knowledge. So maybe I could hand over to Mike and Steve, and then yourself, Helen.
Thank you.
Sure,
Now hand over to Mike, because Mike needs to get off soon. So,
I mean, we've been doing some work advising laboratories internationally on the development of LDTs and how to manage their medical legal risks that the development of in-house tests presents to the laboratories. Many laboratories don't necessarily understand how by manufacturing your own devices, you're taking on a lot more medical legal risk than if you buy conformity assessed regulated products, and that by modifying them, you're essentially taking on the responsibility of the manufacturer. But in order to do that, there's a lot that you can do to mitigate your liability and your risk of being prosecuted if something goes wrong by following state-of-the-art good practice principles. So, verifying, the reagents that you buy, looking for quality products where quality products may be available. So selecting regulated products where you can, or selecting products that have even say like an ISO 9001 quality management system, if you're going to be producing and manufacturing your own tests, and also doing some internal verification of those products as they come into your sort of in-house manufacturing environment. So whilst there isn't currently any guidance that I'm aware of, there is a standard being developed in ISO at the moment, which is looking to provide advice on best practice principles for laboratory developed tests that I think will incorporate some aspects of reagent selection and supplier control. I don't think there's anything at the moment, but it's in the pipeline, and I think there's stuff that can be built upon here.
thanks, Mike. As mentioned previously, we do intend to do a couple more webinars in the future, and I would propose that the commercial contract and the legal impacts is probably dealt with in one of those as well. More specifically, Duncan, your next question about the assurity for changes to legislation and costs, for example, that's not something that we can necessarily answer today, but certainly something that we could probably be able to answer a little bit more in the future. Steve, I'll hand over to you for your hands up, and then I'll move on to the next question.
Thanks. Just to go back to Laurie's question, I've put in the chat reference to a couple of MHRA guidance documents, managing medical devices and managing IVDs. They are the current guidance from MHRA about how to select and supply products and manage those products in your facility. They're quite old, so it may be that at some point they'll need to be reviewed, but they're still the current guidance documents, and I would strongly encourage you to have a look at those.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, so there's another question about withdrawal from the market. Again, I don't think we can answer that one specifically today, but We will be sending a short survey out to your member organisations, and that kind of question will be included there, and that will feed information for further webinars that we hold in the future. That was for Timothy. Another question from Daniel: how does yellow card reporting fit in with this? MHRA responses to issues with medical devices are limited. You can read the question there, Joseph.
Helen, that's a terrific question, and thank you again for the person that raised it. So yellow card is very, very important to us, and we highly encourage everyone to please submit the adverse events through the yellow card system. So as I introduced with the post-market surveillance regulations that's coming up, the requirement to report is very, very important, not only for the device, but for patient safety. So we at the MHRA can see the different trends that's happening across the whole United Kingdom of all devices. So yellow card, very important. Please follow it. There is another system. It's called the Manufacturer's Online Reporting Environment, MORE. That's also sitting alongside the yellow card system. But yellow card, very, very important. Please submit.
Thank you. There's another commercial related question there from David, which we will try to address at a future date, and probably put a response in the Q&A document. Another one here: where we use a number of commercial reagents and bring together an in-house test within an HI setting, but no manufacturer is involved, is this exempt of these regulations?
I could probably just speak to that briefly, Helen. So as Mike just alluded to, where you're combining different reagents together and then developing your own test, you have to make sure you are in compliance with your own UKAS certification, UKAS 15189, for example. So you've got to be really extra careful there. When you're doing that, you need to go through the verification validation of your future tests and making sure that that is executed accordingly. The important thing here is to make sure that the test actually is compliant. That's really very important. In the current regulations, you are able to do that through the work that you're doing through 15189.
Thank you. Steve, your hand's up.
I would just add that agree with what Joseph said completely. Make sure you're following the manufacturer's instructions for use and you're using the device as intended. If you're not using it as intended, then it becomes more complex.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Next one: do you think the combination of different appropriately UKCA marked devices requires separate MHRA registration? For example, a reagent kit by one manufacturer used on the clinical chemistry automated platform of another, so devices in combination, essentially.
I'm just going to refer back to Steve's last answer to that question. Just be extra careful to making sure you follow the intended purpose and instructions that the manufacturer has said.
Again, to come back from like a commercial application, practical application of this, one of our future webinars, we're intending to bring in UKAS as well, to take a UKAS view of how these sorts of things are done as well. So we were intending maybe sort of 6 weeks, depending on what the dates fall as well. So just look out for those, and we'll try and cover as much of these topics that come up in the questions as we are able to do in the scope that we are able to do so. The next one is: what are the plans for MHRA and UKAS to work collaboratively? I think that probably comes into that next webinar as well there, Lara.
Helen, can I just add real quick? We already do. We do. Alison Bryant and myself work very close together, and we actually and with our enforcement team as well. So we have a very strong relationship with UKAS, the MHRA, and with other organisations in government.
Thank you. We've got a statement of concern here, which I will read out. It says, many in-house tests will need to transition to commercial options where available. Concerned over the cost of commercial versus in-house, and the test repertoire not currently offered by a single manufacturer, so likely to need several different kinds of instrumentation. I think that's something that certainly industry are aware of, ABHI and BIVDA certainly. So perhaps, I don't know if there's any comments you want to make there, Joseph. I expect not.
No, not that one.
Okay, next one, what happens? I'm keeping an eye on the time as well for everybody. Remember that we will answer anything that's in the chat, even if we don't get to it at the moment. What happens to reference methods that, for example, in an NHS lab may run as specialist centres, and there is a commercial method available, which is a different technology? We have some in-house methods that are considered gold standard that other laboratories send us to sample to test, where there may be a query or an issue with a commercial method. Would this be an appropriate reason for exemption?
Helen, I'd probably have to delve into the details of that one a bit more. So Joanne, if maybe you could submit more details a bit later on after the session, we would try and answer that one a bit more.
Just to add, if you're looking at an IVDR exemption, it does talk about at the appropriate level of performance. So if you're looking at an alternative test which doesn't have the same level of performance as the one that you're making in-house, then the exemption could still apply. Under IVDR, not under UK regulations as yet.
Yeah.
Thank you, Steve. Next one, I think, is along the same lines. So again, when we come out with our survey and some of the questions related to this, it might be worth giving us more information when we do that, and then we can follow up more specifically. So how is commercial going to be defined? Many trusts offer specialised services using techniques and tests that would be exempt under these definitions. These can be offered outside of the HI that they are developed in, as there are no alternatives. Okay.
Can I just answer very quickly on that? There are certain carve-outs that are described in the consultation response, Alexander, on this one. So have a read through that consultation response that Mike shared on the screen during his section of the presentation. There are specific carve-outs for exactly your point there on specialized services and techniques.
Great, thank you. In terms of laboratory information systems, they are often adapted, amended to suit institutional needs. Would new documentation be needed for every change made? Would this be the responsibility of the company or the laboratory if companies issue upgrades?
I'm not sure I can answer this one, Helen, without more detail.
Okay. Do you want to start, and then that can kind of maybe trigger some ideas. In general, laboratory information systems do not fall into the definition of an IVD. Some modules of a system might, but in general they don't, because they're simply processing data. They're simply handling and storing data and not necessarily processing it. So if it is within the definition of an IVD, if the module is processing data, then it would be, you would need to follow whatever quality management system is in place, and whether that's the manufacturer's quality system for change or your own quality system for change. You would need to do that. That's a very high level response, so it probably needs a bit more detail.
Great. What about newborn screening? It's predominantly done by LDTs. What class would it be?
So there are new classification rules on that. So if you follow the EU classification rules, I think it's C, isn't it, Steve?
Likely, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Does the use of alternative sample types not covered by the manufacturer's registration count as an in-house modification?
It depends, is the answer.
Yeah, my view is it could do.
Okay, thank you. There is a concern about the potential significant resource required to look at these things in each laboratory, given the workloads are increasing, quality workloads are increasing, and some areas of staffing are becoming challenging. Is there a danger that MHRA don't know the scope of IVDs in the UK? How can you just mute everybody except us?
Yeah, I'm very aware of, Leslie, this is a very important question you raised, and I am very aware. I visit a lot of pathology laboratories around England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and very, very conscious of what the situations are with our future regulations. So we do consider this very, very seriously, and the impacts of that are well understood. As I visit the various pathology labs around the NHS trust across the country.
Great, thank you. I think we've probably got time for one more question, but we will answer any that aren't addressed here. So the last one that I'm going to do is LDTs might be exempt when there is no suitable commercially available alternative. But what happens if the suitable alternative is available but costs significantly more? And I'll take this as the last question. Please put any other questions in the bottom. These will be collected and we will respond back in a Q&A document. You'll also see in the chat that I've put an indication of the kind of questions that we will have in our survey. Please do take the time to send that back and we can put more information behind any of your questions here and include it in future webinars. So after that, I'll just pass on to you, Joseph, I presume, for Joanne, and then we'll be able to close the call. So thank you very much for joining, everybody.
Joanne, also a very good question, and thanks for putting it forward. So LDTs could be exempt, but again, you would have to make sure it is verified and validated to make sure that it is working as intended, as you intend it to have. There are sometimes no alternatives, and I get that. There are some very specialist laboratories in the United Kingdom that are very specific for certain tests, and we have been being made aware of those specific laboratories, the super regional networks as part of that, for example. So there are carve-outs again for such situations in the future regulations.
Great, thank you. So thank you very much, Joseph. Thank you very much, Steve, and also to Mike, who's on the call as well. Lots of questions, lots of food for thought. So like I said, we will come back to you with a response as soon as we possibly can. Please continue to send information and questions across to us. We've put in both Mike's email address and Steve's email address, so you can ask those questions directly and we will come back with a combined response from the three organisations. I hope that we'll be able to see you on the next webinar of more detail. Other than that, please enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you very much, everybody, for joining us, and thank you to our speakers as well. Take care.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.